Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day it is that you happen to be checking out this podcast. My name is John, lead pastor of Coram Deo Church, and I'll be your host today on The Blitz. You know, I'm looking outside the window from my office here as I'm recording this, and it is a sunny day in Washington in March, and man, that is a rare thing. I am thankful for that and feeling it. It's better than caffeine. So I hope that you are having a great time, great day, and thanks for joining me here on for this podcast. Our episode is, the topic is a little bit different today. Usually I'm addressing topics, but today is going to be more of telling a story. And I'm going to be talking about why Coram Deo Church withdrew membership from Acts 29. I'm guessing that if you're listening to this, you probably already knew that. We had put out statements to our church family, and we've done that publicly as well, online and through our blog. If you're interested in the documents that were written, you can easily go to coramdeochurch.org, check out the blog section, and there's a whole write-up which contains actually just direct copies of letters that were sent out, and I'll talk a little bit about those later as we get in to this here. But Coram Deo Church is probably one of the, I'm guessing, one of the few churches that joined Acts 29 twice. Okay, so there's a little bit of a story there, and I want to go all the way back to the very beginning of it. So in the early 2000s, I was a youth pastor and had been serving in that capacity for a couple of years, and went into the season in which theology became really important to me. I started diving into what's referred to as Reformed theology or the doctrines of grace, and began to form some strong convictions around that theology. It was also thinking through the book of Acts and thinking about church mission and why it is that the church existed. What was the mission of the church? What was our purpose? What were we trying to accomplish in our community, and what was God's means for accomplishing that? And so while all that stuff is kind of percolating within me, I get invited to go to an Acts class. So a class on the book of Acts. It was taught by a guy named Steve Tompkins at this church in Seattle that was getting a lot of attention called Mars Hill Church. And so I went to this class, and Steve was, at that time, I believe he was the director for Acts 29. And what I found was a guy and a community and a people that were thinking about the same things that I was thinking about. They were taking theology seriously. They had a similar understanding of the doctrines of grace, and they were also thinking about church planting and mission. And that was, in many ways, like a new world for me. And so I got introduced to that and connected with Steve and started to think about something that I'd never thought about in my life before, and that was church planting. And so I was having, coming up with ideas as to what a church might look like, and if I was to plant a church, what that would be like. And I remember attending Mars Hill with a buddy who would also become a pastor. I can't remember if he was a pastor at that point or not. Maybe he was pursuing vocational ministry. I don't remember. In fact, I think maybe he was a youth pastor at that point. And anyways, he ended up inviting me to an evening service on a Sunday to Mars Hill before they were in their big building in Ballard. There was this small building in this neighborhood, and it was just packed to the gills. And I went there, and for whatever reputation Mars Hill had, what I walked away with from that time was the supremacy and the centrality of the Word of God in the life of the people of God. And at that point, a lot of people were getting into the Mars Hill music. It was being driven by Tim Smith, who was and is a great musician and a great leader. But that's not what I walked away with from that time. What I walked away with was powerful preaching, the centrality of the word, and this idea that I had been wrestling with, but hadn't necessarily seen actually, in practice, and that was the preaching of the word as being a central part of the church service, meaning a lot of time was given to the word, and the word was proclaimed, and it wasn't taught in a way that was like, here's some principles for your life, but it was just like, this is what God's word says, and this is what it means for us, and we must change. And that had a profound effect on me, and it was a very peculiar thing, because a lot of the people who were talking church plant were I don't know how to say it. We're like wanted to reach people and maybe had like the heart of an evangelist, but it wasn't heavy on theology. It wasn't heavy on doctrine. It tended to be more vague. And what I saw at Mars and with Mark Driscoll was, man, strong preaching, reaching people, doctrinal conviction and clarity, and a backbone, and people getting baptized. And that had a profound effect on me. And so I started to really wrestle with the sense of my call to plant a church. And so I went through this process with people that I trusted, leaders I had worked with, some family members, and ended up applying to Acts 29 and was accepted into the network. Whether that was a good call on their part or not, I don't know. I guess the jury's still out on that. But I was accepted into the network. And what I found when I entered into Acts 29 was a brotherhood of men who were unapologetic about their biblical doctrinal convictions, and who were also committed to reaching the lost. And that was the most important thing. That was the driving force. And so when we would get together for annual events or whatever, it was just connecting with guys who were in a very similar situation, who had the same struggles. They were maybe a couple years into planting their church, but they were dealing with the same things, and we were all on the same page, and everybody knew where we stood theologically and what we were trying to do. And those early days, and I've heard this from a number of people, the early days they were great. It was so different from what, in many ways, what Acts 29 would end up becoming, and we'll get to that later. But the early days it was great. There was camaraderie, friendship, guys, encouragement, and a real sense of clarity in terms of our direction, what we wanted to see happen as a network, and in a very clear sense of where we stood on theological issues that mattered. And so, not to go into all of the history, but I will say this: without that support in those early years, I don't know that we would have made it. And I'm not calling God's sovereignty into question, saying, hey, if these guys didn't help out, God couldn't have sustained our church. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that God definitely used some of the brothers in Acts 29 to be a huge encouragement to me. And specifically, I'll just say it here. I know there's a lot of haters, but man, Mark Driscoll was a huge encouragement to me early on in our church plan. I'll give you one quick story. We had gone through a very difficult time as a church. We had seen for a young church plant, we had seen a lot of growth, and we went through a difficult season where we had a massive downturn in attendance. There was some drama that we had gone through, and man, it was just not looking good, and I was incredibly discouraged, probably dealing with depression, and just fighting for the church that felt like it was falling apart, and I didn't know what was going to go on. And, we're just a small church in Bremerton, which is, the redheaded stepchild of Seattle. Nobody knows about us. Nobody cares about us. But I still remember getting a phone call from Pastor Mark, from Mark Driscoll, who took time to hear what we were going through. I think that maybe I had posted something on a forum, and he had seen that. It was an Acts 29 forum, and he took the time to call me and just spent time praying for me, spent time encouraging me, just really helped me, talked me through what we were going through and why we were going through it and how this fits into God's plan and what Satan was trying to do to us at that time. And man, there were a couple of interactions like that were just golden. And I'm not sharing that to say that all the other stuff that ever happened didn't happen or it's not true. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that was my experience, and I'm grateful to Mark for doing that, because that was something that God used to really encourage me and keep me fighting, keep me in the game. And here we are today. 19 years into this thing, or 18 years? I can't remember what it is right now. And it was really an important season for me. So I'm very grateful to him for that. All that to say, Acts 29 for a long time was a huge encouragement to me. There were some things that developed, and you're probably aware of many of those. I'm not going to go into details of them, but we ended up leaving Acts 29. That had more to do with some local leadership issues and just where I was at as an individual. I needed to step out and take a break and really think through some things. And at that point, the network, it just wasn't a good fit for me. And so we took a break. And then I think in 2017, something like that, we ended up coming back into the network through a connection with Sean Garman, a friend of mine. And we ended up actually in Basque Country reconnecting. And anyways, we got back into the network, and we're excited to be in the network and had a vision for seeing churches planted internationally. And so, things are going along and everything's fine. And then 2020 hits. And so 2020 obviously was the year of COVID. All that went down, but there was so much more going on with COVID. There was issues with critical race theory. There was racial tensions in our country, and there was also this explosion of transgenderism and the sexual revolution that was taking place, and so there were a lot of questions that were being asked. The culture had changed significantly in a very short amount of time. And one of the things that our elders started to notice was what felt like intentional ambiguity. There was a lack of clarity from the network on some very specific and important things. One was issues regarding church leadership. Who can be an elder? Should women be preaching in the pulpit? So that has to do with like ecclesiology, but then there were also social issues, cultural issues regarding transgenderism and how should the church respond to that. There were issues regarding government overreach with the lockdowns and all of that. And so as these issues kept coming up, it felt to us like Acts 29, like the leadership. Now, what I'm talking about from this point forward, when I talk about Acts 29, I'm talking about top leadership. I'm not talking about the individual churches in the network, because there's a distinction that needs to be made there. But from the leadership, there just wasn't a lot of clarity. So our culture is becoming increasingly confused, and we were looking at leadership to become at least increasingly clear or consistently clear with where we had been in the past on these issues. And it seemed like things were headed in the other direction. Statements that had been part of our network clarifying issues of gender and church leadership and authority were removed from our network, were removed from the website. And so some of these things were concerning. And so early in 2022, I think it was February of 2022, our elders wrote a letter to the board, and that letter is in the blog. You can read it. It is the exact letter that we sent to the board. And what we did is we shared some of our experience over the last 2 years, and we shared some of the concerns we had with culture and theology, and what seemed like the lack of clarity in terms of the gender issues in church leadership, and also a sense of the network being very comfortable with critical race theory and kind of the woke stuff that was going on. And so in that letter, we assumed the best of our leaders, and you'll see that if you read it. But we asked for clarity on these issues. We wanted to know where they were at, where the network was at. And that was a genuine request on our behalf. So that was submitted to the board, the Acts 29 board, in, again, I think that's February of 2022. Well, a couple months go by, and we have heard nothing. We haven't had an email from a board member. We haven't had a text. We haven't had a phone call. We haven't had anything that indicated that the board had ever received the email, and that was or received the letter, and that was, honestly quite surprising and kind of frustrating. I thought, hey, if there's a church that's part of your network and they're been part of the network for a long time and they're contributing financially to this organization, and they're asking for clarity from the board, you would think that the board would just, if nothing else, want to acknowledge the letter and say, hey, thanks for reaching out. We're going to get around to responding to that. But nobody from the board reached out to us. A couple months after we submitted the letter, we did get an email from somebody in Acts 29, and they were willing to talk. But our desire was to hear from the board. The board answers, right? The board sets the direction. The board is accountable. And so we wanted these men on the board to provide some sort of response. And the board was unwilling to do that. And in fact, to this day, the board has never even as much as acknowledged that a letter was received by them. So there were emails that went back and forth in which we were continuing to request for a meeting with the board. And then I went on sabbatical for the summer. I came back, and some additional things had developed. One, Guy Mason, who is an Acts 29 guy in Australia, had preached a sermon, and he was talking about transgender rights. And he made this statement about the church must contend for transgender rights. And he talked about healthcare and bathrooms and all of these things. And the statement was deeply concerning. And so I reached out to the network. I was like, hey, has anybody responded to this? And there was a little bit of a storm on our forum in terms of people chiming in. And some people thought that was a very legitimate question, and others thought that was a ridiculous question. But this is, again, asking the board for some sort of response. Does the Acts 29 board believe that we should be contending for transgender rights? What are transgender rights? Where are these rights grounded in, and what does it mean to contend for them? And so there was no answer to that whatsoever. In addition to that, there were some movements around the board. Some of you know that Matt Chandler, who's the lead pastor of the Village, was the president of the board, and he underwent some very confusing church discipline, sort of church discipline, not really church discipline. Nobody knows what really happened. Handled very poorly. I'll just say that. It was handled very poorly by the elders of the Village Church. And so there was some question about, okay, how does Acts 29 function? How does the board function? What are the bylaws, right? How is this network organized? So that was a question that we had. We wanted to know. We're submitting to those leaders. We want to know how they function. And along with that was questions regarding financial transparency. So I had asked a question to Brian Howard, who was the president of the network, I think at that point, or the president of North America. I don't know what the titles are because they change constantly. But I reached out to him for clarity, and was told that he didn't have time to respond. And so I was directed to Dave Bruskus, who I think at that point was the vice president of Acts 29 North America. And again, I don't know what his position is now. I don't even know if he's part of Acts 29 anymore. But I was directed to him. And again, asking for specific things, going, hey, we contribute money to this organization. It'd be great for us to know how the money is stewarded. I don't want to know what people make. I don't want specifics. I just want to generally know what's going to what specific areas. As a church, this information is available to all of our members. We have a quarterly church family meeting where we give everybody updates on the finances. And if you're a member here and you want to see the budget, you're more than welcome to see it. And so what I was told in terms of the request for the budget was that is an in-house document that is not made publicly available. And that really did not sit well with me in terms of, like, a Christian organization that's trying to build trust and work towards transparency, it seems like that's something you'd want to communicate or at least have a conversation with. And I bounced my kind of gut feeling off of a number of people that I respect, that some that give significantly to nonprofits. And I said, hey guys, this doesn't sit right with me. What do you think? And they all said, yes, that's a red flag. Anytime you have an organization who is unwilling to make its financial information public, especially to a member, right, who's contributing money to this organization, when they refuse to do that, that's a red flag. So we couldn't find out anything regarding finances. We couldn't find out anything regarding the bylaws, and by that I mean we directly, respectfully asked for these things and were denied them multiple times. And at the same time, there was a staff member, Sean Garman, who I mentioned earlier, who was let go from the network. And the details of that were just, it was not good. And so I reached out and was asking for clarity on that. And again, we were getting nothing. And so what we had received from the board over the period of about a year, right, almost a year to the day, was unwilling to address questions regarding critical race theory and woke ideology, unwilling to address or respond to issues of gender roles, particularly as it pertains to the church, unwilling to deal with issues of transgenderism, and not only unwilling to do that, but having pastors who had made extremely problematic statements publicly, then welcoming them into, like Guy Mason, the guy in Australia who made that statement, was then given the stage at the Village Church without any sort of explanation of what in the world he said and what that meant. So a lack of willingness to speak clearly to these issues, on top of a refusal to talk about how they are organized, what their bylaws are, and how money is stewarded. All of those things together painted a very bleak picture of where the network was at and where it was headed. And again, going back to where this whole thing started, Acts 29 for so long was a community of brothers that was, defined by theological precision and clarity and a commitment to mission and a willingness to say the hard things in love because we wanted to honor God and His Word, and we were willing to accept the fallout of that in terms of where culture is at and whatnot. And our experience has been that culture has changed drastically, whether that has to do with the president of Acts 29 or the board, or I don't know. I can't point my finger at one thing and say this is what happened or this is who initiated this change. But my buddy Chase Davis in a recent podcast, he put it this way, and I think this is spot on. Acts 29 has become almost entirely pragmatic. It went from a theologically, missionally driven organization in which you knew where the leaders stood, you knew what we were about. It went from that to an organization that feels like it's playing a game to maintain, people's approval, to be seen in a particular way, not just by culture, but by elite Christian culture. And the byproduct of that is that we're not being clear where we need to be clear. People aren't being treated the way that they need to be treated. There's a lack of transparency. And, it's a sad thing, but at the end of the day, our elders got together and we said, can we submit to a group of men who are unwilling to communicate with us in terms of how they are organized? Can we submit to a group of men who are unwilling to make clear statements, clear theological statements that are pressing issues in our culture right now? Should we keep sending a monthly check to an organization who is unwilling to communicate with us or communicate to us the way in which that money is being stewarded, because we have to give an account for that. Like it's not our money, it's the money that people in our church are giving to the church, and we are giving it to Acts 29. Can we keep doing that with a clear conscience, knowing that the people that we are entrusting this money to are not willing to be honest with us about their finances? And at the end of the day, the answer to that was no, we can't keep doing that. And so what that doesn't mean is that every Acts 29 church has that same issue. I will tell you that all of the churches, pastors that I personally know and I'm connected with in Acts 29, they do not conduct themselves that way. They are good guys and they have good churches, and we may disagree on a couple particulars here and there, but these are good men, and there are a number of good pastors in the network, and there are a number of good churches that remain in the network, and they have chosen, their elders have chosen to remain in for this time, right? And that's great. That's their decision to make. I don't have anything negative to say about them. I make a distinction between them and the leadership of Acts 29. The leadership of Acts 29 has not acted in that way. They have not acted in such a way that would earn and deserve our trust and our respect. And so for us, it just came to the point where we couldn't do it anymore. We had tried, we sought clarity, we wanted to have a conversation, we wanted communication, but that was not going to happen from the network. And so it kind of leaves us in this sad spot, because there was really, there was so much good that came from this network. And I think there's the potential for good to come from it, hopefully in the future. And that would be my hope, is that the people who are in leadership, that their hearts would be softened, that they would repent where they need to repent, that many of them, they need to step down. And it'd be my desire that they would step down. And that Acts 29 could return to being a network of theological clarity with a doctrinal backbone, with a vision for reaching people who don't know Christ. That would be my desire for them, and I genuinely hope that happens. But I don't think that that's going to happen under the current regime, under the current leadership, and that's just. Yeah, it's just the way it is. That's where it is right now. So that is our story. That's our experience. You could probably talk to another E39 guy, and you might find a similar experience. I know some of you have heard the story from The Well in Boulder, Colorado, where my friends Matt Patrick and Chase Davis are co-lead pastors, and I think it was a couple weeks after we resigned from the network, they were removed from the network, which is a crazy story. Acts 29 has removed 2 churches from the network in its life that I know of, one of them being Mars Hill, Driscoll, and the other one being The Well. And those guys were, in my opinion, and I think according to their own testimony, falsely accused and removed, and that was a sad day for Acts 29 and the guys who carried out that decision. But I know a number of other pastors have left the network. I know that there's a number who are in the process of leaving right now, and there's others who are staying to fight. And so I don't have any problem with those guys. I got respect for those guys. But the real concern was with the leadership of Acts 29. So we've moved on. We removed our membership in January of 2023. We had a ton of support and encouragement from our own church and from a number of churches around the country, and surprisingly, a number of churches in the network who feel like they're in the exact same spot. They're not quite yet ready to pull the trigger, but they have the same concerns, and they're waiting it out. So if that's one of you guys, praying for you. I hope it goes well for you, and know that love and respect you for sure. But so that's our story. That's the short version of the story, and I don't know if we're ever going to get the long version, but that's the short version. So if you want to go to our website, you can check out the blog. Again, the letters are posted there. One letter was to the Acts 29 board in early 2022. The second letter was our letter of resignation in January of 2023, and those are both available. They're publicly available. All right, I'm out of breath. It's time to go home. Thanks for hanging out with me today on this episode of The Blitz. And until next time, take care. All right, see you later.